We hear a lot about trade wars,
Yeah.
right? Often painted as this clear-cut fight for jobs, maybe national pride, a real us versus them thing.
Mhm.
But what is the reality, especially when we really dig into the 2025 U.S. tariff war, is just way more complex, even paradoxical.
That's a great way to put it, and it's exactly what we're here to unpack today. This deep dive is all about that 2025 tariff war, the U.S. trade deficit, and crucially, how it all weaves into the political economy of inequality.
Right. So our mission here is to kind of pull back the curtain. We're looking at this core argument that the tariff war wasn't just, an economic misstep,
Yeah.
but what one really thorough analysis calls a great diversion.
Yeah.
A political strategy, basically, to shift public anger away from the real domestic issue, rising income inequality.
Exactly. And we'll get into why this policy failed even on its own terms, what the hidden costs were for everyday people, and what it really meant for American prosperity, but also for the global financial system. And just so you know where we're coming from, our insights today are grounded in a pretty detailed paper. It combines macroeconomic analysis with empirical models, using data from places like the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the CBO,
Right, the Congressional Budget Office.
analyses from the Budget Lab at Yale, the Fed, Oxford Economics, solid sources.
Good stuff. Okay, let's unpack this. I think for most people, hearing U.S. trade deficit just sounds bad, like money leaking out of the country, a simple loss. Is that too simplistic?
It is, yeah. It's a common, almost gut-level reaction, but when you look objectively, data-driven,
Hmm.
it reveals a much more complex structural reality. That idea of simple wealth leakage, it's really a populist framing that misses the bigger economic picture entirely.
So if it's not just leakage, what were the actual numbers saying? What did that deficit look like around, say, 2024 or 2025?
Well, the numbers were pretty stark, actually. In 2024, the total U.S. trade deficit in goods and services hit $918.4 billion.
Wow, almost $1 trillion.
Yeah, and that was a big jump, 17% up from 2023. And even by May 2025, the monthly deficit was still sitting around $71.5 billion. These aren't just numbers, they show a persistent trend that just flew in the face of the tariff war's stated goals. It reveals a pretty fundamental miscalculation right from the start.
And something you hear a lot in political talk is just focusing on the goods deficit. But the analysis we're looking at makes a point about distinguishing goods versus services. Is that important?
Oh, it's crucial. You're hitting on a key point. Yes, the U.S. runs a massive goods deficit over $1.21 trillion in 2024. No doubt about that.
Huge.
But at the same time, the U.S. has a significant and growing surplus in services. Think financial services, intellectual property, digital exports. That hit $293.3 billion in 2024.
So focusing only on goods gives a skewed picture.
And completely skewed. It ignores a major area where the U.S. is actually very competitive globally.
Okay, so it's not just about imports and exports of stuff. The paper also talks about the current account deficit, saying it's a wider macroeconomic thing. What does that mean practically?
Right. Practically, it means the trade deficit is just one part of a bigger equation. The current account includes trade, yes, but also things like income from investments abroad. And that broader measure ballooned to 6.0% of GDP in the first quarter of 2025.
6%? That sounds high.
It is high. And that jump is a really clear signal that we're dealing with something deep in the structure of the economy, driven by forces way beyond just swapping goods. It's about how the whole U.S. economy plugs into the global financial system.
This also seems to push back against the idea that it's all about one or two bad actors, like China being solely responsible. The analysis shows deficits with lots of countries, right?
Exactly. China was the biggest single goods deficit country, yes.
Right, yeah.
$295.4 billion in 2024. But look at the others. The European Union, $235.6 billion. Mexico, $171.8 billion. Vietnam, $123.5 billion. These are substantial and growing.
And you said that growth, especially with Mexico and Vietnam, is interesting.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. That sharp growth is direct evidence of what economists call trade diversion.
Trade diversion. So what does that mean for, someone listening or for businesses here?
It means the tariffs didn't really stop Americans from buying foreign goods overall. They just made us buy them from somewhere else.
Oh, okay.
So instead of getting certain things from China, maybe they started coming from Vietnam or Mexico. Often this rerouting meant higher costs and less efficiency. Demand just shifted. It didn't disappear.
So the tariffs didn't fix the underlying reason we were importing so much.
Precisely. And here's the kicker. The U.S. has run an annual trade deficit every single year since 1976.
Since 1976, wow.
Nearly 50 years of deficits, despite all sorts of policy changes. That structural persistence just It blows up the whole premise that the tariff war could fix the deficit by targeting specific countries.
So, okay, the deficit isn't just a simple scorecard. It's a symptom of something bigger, tied into the global financial system. Which brings us to this fundamental economic idea, the indestructible accounting identity. Sounds important.
It is, and it really flicks the script on the deficit. It's a core principle. A country's current account balance, think trade deficit, mostly must mirror its capital and financial account balance.
Mirror image.
Okay.
How does that work?
In simple terms, a trade deficit means a capital surplus. Think about it, when the U.S. buys more goods and services from abroad than it sells, where do those dollars go? They don't just vanish.
Right.
Foreign companies and governments that earn those dollars overwhelmingly reinvest them back into the U.S., buying U.S. assets, stocks, treasury bonds, real estate. So the money flows out for goods, but flows back in as investment. Two sides of the same coin.
Okay, that makes sense. And this connects to the exorbitant privilege, right? Why is there this constant global appetite for U.S. assets? Why do they keep sending the money back here?
Ah, the exorbitant privilege, yes. It comes down to the unique status of the U.S. dollar. It's the world's dominant reserve currency. Still is.
Meaning other countries hold on to dollars.
A lot of dollars. In 2022, nearly 60% of global central bank reserves were in dollars. It's used for pricing oil, for most international trade, for global debt. This creates this constant underlying global demand for dollars, and therefore for safe places to park those dollars, like U.S. Treasury bonds.
So this privilege, what does it let the U.S. do?
Well, the term was coined back in the 60s by a French finance minister, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. He saw that the U.S. could basically finance its spending, consumption, investment, government debt by issuing dollars and bonds that the rest of the world just eagerly snapped up, often at low interest rates.
Like printing money that the world accepts for real goods.
Essentially, yeah. Economist Barry Eichengreen put it bluntly. The U.S. can buy real stuff from abroad by printing a $100 bill that costs pennies to make. It's a massive financial advantage.
And the paper mentions another layer, the exorbitant return. What's that?
That's another interesting twist. Even though the U.S. is technically the world's largest net debtor on paper,
Right, owes more than it's owed.
it often earns more income on its investments abroad than foreigners earn on their investments in the U.S. We tend to hold higher yield assets overseas, while foreigners often hold lower yield, super safe U.S. treasuries. So, despite being a debtor, we can still have a net positive income flow from investments.
Okay, pulling this together. It sounds like the trade deficit isn't a flaw, but maybe a necessary feature of this whole system where the dollar is king.
That's a really insightful way to put it. It's not a bug, it's a feature. For the dollar to be the global reserve currency, the U.S. has to supply enough dollars and safe dollar assets, like treasuries, to the world.
And how do we do that?
Primarily by running a current account deficit. We buy more than we sell, pumping dollars out into the global economy. Those dollars then circle back as investments, funding our capital markets. It's a self-reinforcing cycle, really.
Which highlights a massive contradiction in the 2025 tariff war, doesn't it? The stated goal was eliminate the trade deficit,
Right.
but also keep the dollar dominant globally. You're saying those two things just don't go together.
They are fundamentally incompatible, mutually exclusive. Think about it. If a policy actually eliminated the U.S. current account deficit, it would drastically cut the supply of dollars flowing to the rest of the world.
Which would undermine the dollar's role.
Exactly. It would choke off the supply, weaken its reserve status, and destroy that very exorbitant privilege we just talked about. It shows the policy was driven by a political story, not sound macroeconomics. You just can't have it both ways.
Okay, so the theory didn't hold up. Yeah. Let's move to the practice. What did the empirical evidence show? Did the tariff war actually work in the real world? Any upside?
No, not really. On its own stated terms, reducing the trade deficit, it was an absolute failure. As we said, the overall deficit didn't shrink. It ballooned from $784.9 billion in 2023 to $918.4 billion in 2024.
So goal number one missed completely.
Completely invalidated the main economic argument they gave publicly.
And the costs. Who ended up paying for these tariffs? Was it foreign companies or, folks here?
It was overwhelmingly U.S. households and businesses footing the bill. The tariffs acted like a big, hidden tax increase, and a regressive one at that.
How so?
Well, when a tariff is imposed, the U.S. importer usually pays it. Then they pass that cost on down the line. The budget lab at Yale did an analysis estimating these tariffs pushed up the overall price level by about 1.8% to 2.0%.
Doesn't sound huge, but what does that mean per family?
It translated to an average income hit of maybe $2,400 to $2,700 per household per year. And the price hikes were really sharp on everyday things, shoes up maybe 40%, apparel 38%, even cars over 12%. These hit lower and middle income families hardest because they spend more of their budget on these kinds of goods.
Okay, so it hurt consumers. Did it help the broader economy, boost growth or investment?
No, the opposite. The CBO projected the tariffs would actually reduce real GDP. Yale's budget lab estimated a lasting drag of about 4.4% of GDP. That's around $115 billion lost annually. And think about the uncertainty. The Penn Wharton budget model pointed out that businesses hate uncertainty, the constant threat of new tariffs, shifting rules. It makes companies hesitant to invest, to hire. It put a chill on things.
And the jobs, that was the big promise, right? A manufacturing renaissance? Do we see that?
That narrative just didn't happen. In fact, the policy seems to have led to net losses in manufacturing jobs.
Losses? How?
Well, a Federal Reserve study found that, yeah, maybe some tiny gains happened in the specific industries shielded by tariffs, but those were swamped by bigger losses elsewhere in manufacturing. Think about companies using imported parts. Their costs shot up. Or companies that export, they got hit by retaliatory tariffs from other countries.
So gains in one small area, losses in others.
And the net effect, an estimated 1.4% decrease in total manufacturing employment. Other studies, like one from Oxford Economics, estimated about 245,000 jobs lost across the entire U.S. economy due to the tariffs.
So the irony here is pretty stark. Marketed as helping workers, but it ended up costing them money through higher prices, costing jobs overall, and shrinking the economy.
Exactly. The outcomes were basically the opposite of the rhetoric, which points away from economic logic and strongly towards, well, politics.
Which brings us right to this idea of the Great Diversion, the notion that the tariff war was really a political sleight of hand. But to get there, we have to acknowledge the real pain that made that anti-trade message resonate, right?
Absolutely crucial point. You can't dismiss the grievances. The era of intense globalization did create enormous wealth overall, but the benefits were spread incredibly unevenly.
Yeah.
Working and middle-class folks in many developed countries, definitely including the U.S., saw their incomes stagnate or even fall for decades. That creates real, legitimate social discontent. People felt left behind, and frankly, many were. That frustration is real.
Okay, but here's a key question the paper raises. Lots of countries face globalization pressures. Why did it seem to translate into such extreme inequality here in the U.S.? What made us different?
That's the critical question. And the argument in the analysis is that the main cause wasn't globalization itself, but specific domestic policy choices made in the U.S., mostly starting around the 1980s.
Domestic choices, like what?
Look at data from the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's really revealing. U.S. market income inequality that's before government steps in is high, sure, but pretty comparable to some other developed nations.
Okay.
But after taxes and government transfers, like social benefits, that's when the U.S. becomes a major outlier. We end up with one of the highest levels of disposable income inequality.
Meaning our government does less to even things out.
Significantly less. Our tax and benefit systems do much less to mitigate the inequality the market generates compared to, say, many European countries.
So what specific domestic policies drove this American exceptionalism in inequality? The paper points to a couple of big ones.
Yeah, two stand out. First, tax policy. Since the 80s, the federal tax system has become much less progressive. Top income tax rates came way down, and capital gains income from investments, which mostly goes to the wealthy, get taxed at lower rates than income from work. That directly widens the gap.
Okay, tax policy, what's the second driver?
The decline of labor unions. Unions used to be a powerful force for compressing wages, raising the bottom and middle, maybe capping the very top and giving workers more bargaining power.
Right.
But union density in the private sector has plummeted. It was over a third for male workers in the early 70s. Now it's under 10%. There's a really strong correlation between that decline and the sharp rise in wage inequality. Less worker power meant stagnant wages for many, while executive pay went through the roof.
So you have this real public anger over inequality and stagnant wages, fueled by these domestic policy choices. It becomes politically much easier to point fingers outward.
Exactly. Blaming an external enemy, China is stealing our jobs, the trade deficit is killing us, is politically far simpler than confronting powerful domestic groups who benefit from those low taxes on capital or weaker labor laws.
That's the great diversion.
That's the great diversion. The narrative shifts the blame. It resonates, it mobilizes people, and it distracts from addressing those really tough domestic policy questions.
And the way the tariff war played out, kind of chaotic, unpredictable, driven by headlines.
Makes zero sense as careful economic policy.
Right.
But as political theater, it makes perfect sense. Projecting strength, fighting a visible foreign foe, keeping your base energized. It checks all those boxes, even if the economics are upside down.
Okay, let's talk long-term consequences then. This wasn't just a blip. It risked damaging the foundations of U.S. prosperity. First, this issue of uncertainty and fragmentation.
Yeah, businesses thrive on predictability. A stable policy environment lets them plan, invest for the long term. The tariff war threw all that out the window. Radical uncertainty.
Which chills investment.
Big time. And it forced companies into these costly, often inefficient reshuffles of their supply chains. You heard terms like China plus one or nearshoring, basically moving production just to avoid tariffs, even if it meant higher costs or more complexity. That fragments production, raises costs. Ultimately, consumers often pay.
And this also fit into the idea of a great decoupling, particularly with China, and maybe made the world riskier.
It definitely fueled that trend, especially in high-tech sectors. And yeah, there's a real risk there. Fracturing the global economy into competing blocks could make everyone poorer and less secure. It's a step back from an interconnected system that, for all its flaws, generated a lot of wealth and innovation.
Plus, going it alone, it alienated allies, right?
Absolutely. Imposing tariffs unilaterally, even on allies like the EU or Canada, it created a friction, undermined cooperation, made it harder to build a united front on genuine trade issues where collective action might actually work.
So if we connect all these dots, the ultimate paradox seems to be this. The policy attacked the global trading system. But that very system is what props up the U.S. dollar's central role, the source of the exorbitant privilege.
That's the mind-bending conclusion, and it's deeply ironic. We established that trade deficit is, in many ways, a symptom of the dollar's power. That power relies on other countries being willing partners, holding our debt, using our currency.
Right.
So when you disrupt the system, antagonize those partners, you give them a strong incentive over the long run to look for alternatives to the dollar, to accelerate de-dollarization.
It's trying to fix a symptom.
Ends up attacking the very source of American financial power. It's like, as the paper suggests, trying to fix your plumbing by taking a sledgehammer to the foundation of your house. You might stop the leak, but you've created a much bigger, more fundamental problem.
Okay, so this deep dive has really shown that 2025 tariff war was, well, a major policy failure. Bad economics, didn't achieve its goals, imposed real costs, and the underlying logic seems much more political, that great diversion from domestic inequality.
Yeah, that sums it up well. And it really underscores that just going back to the way things were before 2025 isn't really the answer either. Those legitimate grievances about inequality that fueled the protectionist sentiment, they still need to be addressed.
So a different path forward is needed. The analysis suggests a kind of two-pronged strategy.
That's right, a more sophisticated approach.
First prong, focus inward. Rebuild shared prosperity here at home. Seems like the main battle for American prosperity is actually domestic.
Exactly. That means serious investment in people, education, job training, upgrading infrastructure, strengthening the social safety net so people feel more secure, and, critically, tackling those domestic policy drivers we talked about.
Tax and labor policy.
Yes, making the tax system fair, ensuring the wealthy pay their share, and restoring some bargaining power to workers, strengthening unions. Building up the middle class again, that's probably the best defense against economic nationalism.
Okay, focus inward first. Second prong, engage outward, but strategically, leading through alliances, not unilateral actions.
Right. Ditch the chaotic tariffs. Work with democratic allies in Europe, in Asia, to set fair global trade rules. If there are genuine abuses, intellectual property theft, unfair subsidies, market access barriers, tackle them together. A coordinated front is much more effective.
And maybe try to fix the institutions we have, like the World Trade Organization.
Lead the effort to reform and strengthen them. Absolutely. Restore faith in a rules-based global order, but one that's updated for today's challenges.
So thinking about the listener, what does all this mean for you? It's kind of sobering to consider that the price you pay for shoes, the stability of the whole global economy, maybe even the future value of the dollar in your pocket, it's all connected to these complex economic forces, but also, critically, to deliberate domestic policy choices.
Yeah, and understanding this great diversion isn't just an academic exercise. It's about recognizing how political narratives can literally shape your economic reality.
And maybe seeing what possibilities open up if we shift the focus away from blaming outsiders and towards tackling the real internal drivers of economic well-being and shared prosperity.
That's the hopeful path forward, I think.